Number of people here. So hi everybody, thank you for joining. I'm Andy Heath at C Squared, and I'll sort of chair this webinar in regard to, well, the webinar is discussing ventilation post-COVID. What changes are we going to see, if any, and how is that going to impact upon the commercial real estate market? We're lucky enough to have a dynamic trio of speakers for you today. First up will be Kath Macpherson, who's Regional Head of Workplace at Hoare Lea, involved in a number of major schemes in and around the Bristol area. And more importantly, from a BCO perspective, Kath chairs the Southern Region judging panel for the BCO Awards. We have Toby Pentecost, who is the co-founder of Candor, a privately owned developer specialising in sustainable development in a number of different cities around the UK. And in relation to the region, Toby heads up the scheme at Four Glass Wharf, development by Temple Meads. And we have Stephen Taylor, Director at AHMM, who's responsible for setting up the Bristol office a number of years ago and is developing a specific expertise in the commercial-led mixed-use development. Steve's recent projects include White Collar Factory in London, 2 New Bailey Square in Manchester, and the soon-to-be, if not today, I think, Steve, isn't it, completed building assembly in Bristol. The format will be that the 3 speakers will cover about 30 minutes. We will then move into a Q&A session. Kath will give us the technical appraisal on the issues around ventilation and the future and what that may hold. Toby will give us the developer's perspective and how they see the future and what they're doing to look at this topic. And then Steve will give us the occupier's perspective as they prepare to move into 1 Portwall Square next year, their new Bristol HQ, which is currently under development. So that will last for about 30 minutes. We'll then move to a Q&A session. And you'll see at the bottom there in the chat box, if you have any questions as we go through, please pop them in there and we will cover those at the end. I think without any further ado, I will therefore pass you over to Kath to get us going. Thank you all.
Thanks, Andy. So just to give you a brief overview of why indoor air quality and ventilation systems are so important. Just to give you some key facts on that, to start with, we spend 90% of our lives indoors on average. And actually there's 2 to 5 times more pollution indoors than outdoors. And obviously various studies have shown that better indoor environmental conditions will improve employee productivity. So looking at in more detail at one of these studies, this one looks at the carbon dioxide levels in a space and shows how this links to the occupants' cognitive scores. Clearly, increasing ventilation rates increases the CO2 levels in a space, so therefore will improve productivity. But as we are all more than aware, in the last year, everything changed. Ventilation and air quality has moved right up the agenda, and it goes beyond well-being and productivity and becomes an issue of health and safety. Through the winter, this hands, face, space and ventilation mantra was pushed out by the government, as it was clear that getting ventilation through a space will provide a significant reduction on the ability for the virus to spread. So let's talk in a bit more detail about viral control. There's been a lot of recent evidence. Obviously, there's been a lot of studies carried out during the pandemic. And what they've found is that airborne transmission is the main cause of cross-infection, which has made ventilation measures the most important method of infection control. So while physical distancing is important to avoid close contact, the risk of airborne transmission and cross-infection over a distance of more than 1.5 meters can reduce significantly with adequate ventilation and effective air distribution. For ventilation to be effective, both for the quantity of air and the pattern of air distribution are important. There are 3 key elements of ventilation. That's the ventilation rate, the airflow direction, and the airflow pattern. And here's quite a nice study that makes it very clear how just getting ventilation through a space will reduce the risk of infection. So this is 2 hours spent in the classroom with no measures, and you'll see that there are 12 students infected. If everybody wears a face mask, this drops to 5. But if the room is ventilated through the lesson and the class is stopped after an hour, so that the air can totally refresh, the risk drops dramatically to only 1. So as that has clearly identified, ventilation has a huge effect on the spread of the virus. And looking at the rates you'd normally expect in an office, ranging from the minimum for Part F, which I would note is not necessarily always the case in some existing offices, up to the best practice for BCO, you can see that there's a significant decrease in the risk of infection just between the upper and lower limits. You basically are cutting the risk by about 1/3 by increasing to the upper recommendations of BCO of 2 litres per second per square metre. And then what this also shows in the graph on the right is there's actually a much higher risk if you're in a smaller meeting room. So this makes larger spaces much safer in this current environment. As the reason why it's so much worse in a smaller meeting room is just the air flow rate and the time, the number of occupants in there, and the way the study was done was assuming there was always 1 person that had the virus. So clearly, if you're in a meeting room and with close contact to somebody that's got the virus, you're at a much higher risk of infection. So recommendations are to limit the amount of time in meeting rooms and limit the amount of people in them at present. And going forward, it's really important to monitor CO2 levels, monitor occupancy, and make sure you're getting throughputs of air purging after people have been occupying the rooms. And looking in a bit more detail at airflow, some of the recommended changes to an office space design. Here's a typical fan coil unit arrangement. Currently in office design, we quite often just have a bell mouth at the core, and we basically pull air through the space. And even when you cellularize, quite often you would just put some sort of transfer duct in the cellularized area, either in the ceiling void or just in the wall. But that then means that if you're taking air from an infected room, you're dragging it right across the office space. So better practice now would be for in a Cat B fit out to actually directly connect onto any rooms to make sure you're getting the proper through flow of air through those meeting rooms, and also not dragging any infected air across the office floor plate. Obviously, it's also important to look at where people are sitting. I think it was shown on the in the restaurant where the virus started to spread initially, that if you've got people sat directly where the air has been blown out and you've got somebody sat here that's infected and pulling, therefore the fan coil's just sucking through the infected air, that's clearly not good practice. So you do need to consider also the layout. So just very briefly on existing properties, this page has got too much information, I know, but this is available on the web at the Federation of European Heating, Ventilation and Air Conditioning Associates, and it's a really good document if you do have an existing building and you want to consider the measures you need to use to mitigate infection control in your existing property. And also it's good practice for new builds. Some of the key things are, if you've got a recirculating air handling unit, making sure you're not recirculating the air. Another interesting point was there has been a lot of debate about humidity control in the space. They're suggesting that it doesn't really have a significant impact. However, we do know that if it's a really dry space, actually the risk of getting infected is higher, because people do in winter because the air is drier. So I think the jury's still out on that one. But yeah, I would recommend if you have an existing building to have a read of that. And now just quickly looking at the draft building regulations. So listed on the right, we've got what is in these draft regulations. However, I would note that this is just being put out for consultation. It's not been adopted. So some or all of these might not be in the final paper. There's been a lot of people provided comments back on all these points. But I suppose just to note that it is looking like they will be looking for the ability to boost ventilation rates and also to monitor in meeting rooms or occupied space of more than 15 people. So yeah, we'll watch this space, but I think there definitely will be a change in rates from the 1 litre per second that we currently see. And then the BCO specification has been recently updated to increase ventilation rates per person to 14 litres per second per person. This is just being updated, but this is only the start of the research that they are doing into ventilation post-pandemic. So that's still an ongoing research piece. So there might be some more changes that come out of that. Another point that could be considered is whether occupancies will reduce. We don't know what the trend will be. Obviously, if occupancies reduce, then actually the ventilation systems as they're designed will probably give you more ventilation per person than is required of the new guide. And just touching briefly on accreditations, you're probably all familiar with, well, obviously BREEAM and the Well Building Standard. Air rated is quite a new one, which only focuses on the air quality aspect of the Well Building Standard. And then we've got both Well and Fitwel have brought out separate accreditations, just looking at health and safety aspect of a scheme. So if you are focused in making your building as approachable for tenants to come in and feel that they're safe, these might be something you want to do if you're not already doing the full Well Building Standard or Fitwel accreditations. So in summary, I think the shift towards better air quality that we've already seen with the Well Building Standard is becoming even more important with the pandemic. Air quality monitoring and increased ventilation rates are likely to become the norm as the world recovers from this pandemic and as we try to attract people back to the workspace. So with that, I will hand you over to Toby to discuss what he thinks will be attracting people back to their workspace and tenants to this building as a developer.
Thanks, Kath. That was brilliant. And thank you very much for showing all that sort of data and research. It's clear that we're at the sort of beginning of interpreting what the last year's meant. And that's obviously going to be reflected in sort of legislation and then guidance, best practice and stuff. I'm not that suitable to this webinar in the sense that I'm not a technical person, but luckily Kath has got technical side covered and so too does Steve. And so I guess my perspective is somewhat of a non-technical or lay person and how our approach as a developer for workspace developments feeds into our strategy and how internal air quality has been a feature of how we design buildings and building strategy. So I'm going to talk about two things primarily, I suppose. The first thing is kind of the market, the driver and the customer piece. And then the second bit is more of a case study on how our scheme in Bristol will deliver how and why internal air quality will be sort of assessed and managed in our scheme. Again, from a very high level, so technical questions is not really me, but luckily there's other people on the call. So the first question we would sort of ask is, of course, with any scheme is, you know, who is my customer and who's asking the question, and how has that sort of changed over time? Our experience as a developer is that in previous cycles, shall we say, workspace development, workspace occupancy decisions are made by sort of like C-suite and decision makers. So imagine that to be a CEO or an FD or a COO, whereas we feel that now decisions are being made on workspace buildings by sort of the user group. So if you say, avoid the C-suite and look at the kind of wider employee level, will people want to use this building? And of course, that keys into the wider discussion of we've spent the last 18 months working from home, lots more than we did before. And so the office has gone from being an obligatory standard to now an amenity, an optional amenity. And one of the lots of ways that office occupiers will attract their users would be, of course, making them as attractive as possible. And from our perspective, that's always been something that we've had to interpret as a developer, and it's mostly been focused on sort of amenities such as somewhere you can meet friends, or somewhere where you can get exercise, or somewhere where you can kind of break out and fill in around your sort of 9-to-5 work. Whereas now that demand from users is spreading into the kind of well-being and sort of public health bit, I suppose. So that customer then has gone from being, decision makers down to the wider mass. And in doing so, it's looking at it in much more of a sort of public health perspective. And in the past, office buildings of the past have been measured on, and Andy hopefully will support this. We've looked at things like lighting levels internally, glare and eye strain, temperature and comfort, cooling, fresh air levels. Talked a lot about fresh air levels in the past. Density, of course, is massive, and I see there was a question on the chat about densities, and I think we'll probably come onto that in the questions as well. And then there was a big, there's been an increasing sort of amenity question, where will I park my bike? Can I shower? Are there towels? Is there somewhere for me to, do yoga? And can I even see a dentist in my office building? Those sorts of questions. And that has spread now into sort of internal air quality, along with one or two other things that are more health related and less kind of, for want of the right term, sort of lifestyle related. So that, we think, is how our customer has changed. And clearly the internal air quality thing is about kind of, right now it's thinking about sort of how viruses move around our internal spaces, for example, and Kath really talked about that, which is really important. And of course, the other thing is it was creeping onto our agenda as a consequence of airborne carbons and stuff that we've become more aware of as a consequence of quite a lot of the widely publicized work in terms of the health damage of carbon in the air that we breathe in our urban centres, which I guess leads me on to the second point, which is our scheme in Bristol. It is an urban scheme. It's 250 metres from Temple Mead Station, so it's a very sustainable location, which is brilliant. That comes with challenges as well, because we know that air quality, external air quality, has an impact on internal air quality. So when we came up with our strategy for the building, the first thing that we did is try to create a baseline. So we looked to measure external air quality at different datum points in terms of heights from grade around our building to assess to assess the external air quality that will feed into the strategy around internal air quality. I'm pleased to see Kath nodding here. This is good. And so that created our baseline, and that feeds into our strategy, where we position the air handling units, where we take air in, where we push exhaust air out, and of course, when we take that air in, what it looks like and feels like and how it tests, and so how much the filtration needs to kind of work through that air to create internal air quality that we're satisfied with. I hope Stephen will touch on opening windows. I think he will, and that has that's kind of more his domain. But what I will say, of course, is in our position in Bristol, we think it's fantastic that the clean air zone that hopefully will be implemented later this year in Bristol will do even more work to further increase the quality or reduce the pollutants in the air, in central Bristol, and that will have, of course, a positive effect on all buildings. So it's not just buildings that have opening windows that will benefit from that reduction in pollutants in the air. So we'll measure it, create the design, and then we'll look at other tangible areas within our CapEx, such as the filters in our air handling system, and that is governed by our benchmarking, and our benchmarking in this case is WELL. So we're shooting for WELL Platinum on our scheme, and that, as guided by our sort of engineering team, is in order to get that certification, we're having to spend in the right areas, and in one of the areas we chose to spend in filters to get that platinum. And then the second thing is within this piece is tangible internal air quality factors in operation. So putting filters in is very important, but possibly equally or maybe more important is managing those filters and having a regime. And then secondly, and I think this is something that Hoare Lea have really sort of pushed a lot across their workspace schemes, is monitoring of internal air quality. So I think Kath touched on this before, but obviously design a building on a basis of assumptions, and then those assumptions become a reality, and the only way to understand that and interpret that is to monitor. So in order to, again, achieve the WELL Platinum, there's a certain amount of internal air quality and CO2 internally monitoring taking place that feeds into the building management system that will that we are constantly improving on. And there's an evolution of smart tech that will measure how many people are using a building and for how long, and what sort of purging is going on between meeting sessions in smaller rooms, and then overnight purging across the whole building. And that we're really excited to get into that and go along on a journey and try to understand how we can use that data to better increase the performance of the occupiers of the building. And then finally, and this is my last point on strategy, is we made a decision on our building to sort of create a sort of intangible and perceived benefit in air quality, sort of internal air quality. So it's hard to quantify, and we don't know quite yet what impact this is going to have, but we've increased our floor to ceilings to create a bigger volume of air. And we think that will help to encourage people to come back to the office, just as people are more uncomfortable, shall we say, getting on a tube carriage because it's a small confined space. We think people will be more encouraged to stand in, for example, a concert hall or a train station, with obviously, ventilation caveats to that. But effectively creating big volume, big spaces of air, we think will encourage people back to a high quality workspace. And I think with that, that's me. And I'm going to hand over now to Steve, who's going to talk from the perspective of architecture and design.
Fantastic. Thanks, Toby. I'm going to just try and share screen. Hopefully we can all see that. So I was asked to come along to talk about our experiences as an occupier, strangely enough, rather than as an architect. But I think to give it some context, it's as an occupier of hopefully early next year, number 1 Portwall Square, which we were commissioned to design on behalf of Nord as a private developer, independent developer. And born out of our experience of converting old buildings, and a number of buildings here you can see on the screen, many of which weren't designed originally as office buildings, but yet converted brilliantly in the latter 20th, now 21st century as places to work. So there's a question that we posed ourselves a little while ago as a precursor to the designs at 1 Portwall Square around what can we learn about those old buildings, which naturally had passive design features around their environmental credentials, opening windows, tall ceilings, robust structure, and a robustness to change as well, robustness to change over time. So buildings that were never designed as offices actually converted quite well as kind of modern workspaces. And then the sort of wider question was really about what is it of modern purpose designed and built office buildings that somehow have failed and somehow lost something in sort of translation. So what starts as a question and a set of research, sort of research investigation, created a concept which we named White Collar Factory. We built a prototype of that concept to demonstrate to ourselves and to the BCO and to the market that these ideas work. And it's picking up on a lot of the ideas that Kath's talked about, that Toby's already picked up on the work that they're doing down at Glass Wharf. So it's about tall ceilings, it's about stripping away, it's about facades, structure, surfaces and skin working together rather than being designed in silos. So facades that respond to orientation, a structure that provides the cooling as well as an aesthetic, as well as clearly the structure. So doing a lot more with a lot less, and designing buildings such that nothing can be taken away, but everything is you know, the structure and infrastructure there such that things can be added over time. So this is a concept which was sort of non-site specific, really, very much a prototype, which could then be applied to sites. So we applied it initially at the White Collar Factory, which some of you might be familiar with, building in London. But more importantly, it was then a sort of demonstration for us as architects and working with Nord of applying those same principles to a different market, different sector, different context in Bristol, ultimately with us as an occupier on the lower floors of this building. So it's a small building, 1 Portwall Square. It's you recognise the position here. It's just on the back of the old London Life building at 100 Temple Street.
Steve, sorry, can I just jump in there? I'm
yes.
still, I don't know whether everyone else can see this. I'm still on your front slide. I don't know if
Are you? Okay.
Is that just me or is everyone else?
Same here, and we've got the blue wheel of doom.
Yeah.
Really? I do apologise.
It might be the wrong window. Maybe.
Okay. Shall I? What do you suggest I do? I'm currently on slide 5.
Stop
Quite
sharing and try sharing again.
Exactly.
Shall I do that?
Off and on again.
Okay, classic. Okay. There we are. How's that?
There we go. That's slide 5.
Can you see that? Slide
Yep.
5. Fantastic.
Portwall Square.
Right, let's try again. So I don't know whether I just flick back to a couple of the previous slides just to explain some of those points around. It's not working for me now. Here we are. Let's move forward. So hopefully that's now moved to a view from street level, looking at the building at 1 Portwall Square. So it's a building adjacent to 100 Temple Street. And like Toby, we sort of recognise that importance of tall floor to ceiling heights. So in this instance, the original White Collar Factory building was a floor to floor of 4 meters. In this context, we've matched an existing floor-to-floor height of the adjacent building of being a little over 4.2 meters. So we've increased that even further to generate that height and volume that Toby talked about, that kind of cathedral feel of space, and the opportunity for the sort of stale and warm air to naturally rise out of that occupied zone in order for it to then be either absorbed, the heat absorbed by exposed concrete slabs and thermal mass, and also for the stale air to be extracted at high level back in towards the core. So you can see here also picking up on a few points from a sort of urban context point of view, where the building's been pushed back away from the street edge, in part to protect and retain 2 existing trees, which was felt to be really important in creating a place. That provides some natural solar shading to the building on this kind of more southerly aspect of the facade. And then above that building, a sort of very strong base, and then sort of 5 floors of sort of linear, very simple floor plates above as a floor plan. So very simple, sort of legible floor plate. So the idea of a core tucked off on one side, which sort of sits cheeked by jowl with the core of 100 Temple Street. So using that kind of blank facade to put our building up against it. And then from that core, just stepping it out and onto a very simple floor plate, 15 by 39 meters, about just over 6,000 square feet. Staircases are brought front to center. So that idea about walking, moving through the building via staircases, encouraging that use rather than lift, sort of being crammed into the lifts. And I think that, that we'll see a lot more of that post-pandemic. And then sort of straight onto a very simple floor plate. Now, the scale and proportion of this building allows us to have facades that can then open up to provide a lot of natural ventilation, or a mixed mode ventilation system in across the floor plate. So it's the idea about facades responding to orientation. So towards a southerly aspect, we're pushing facades back away from the building edge, in doing so providing outdoor amenity, and we all know the importance of that in terms of health and well-being, but important also, I think, post-pandemic, the opportunity for breaking out and meeting and collaborating externally as well as internally. So you've got this kind of height of a space, you've got the outside amenity, pushing the facade back. The amenity in turn provides a lot of that solar shading where it's most needed. So again, sort of facades and structure and services working together as a very sort of simple, elegant solution. So because of the size of a floor plate, we can provide natural ventilation through the facade on 3 sides, which we're pulling air in into plant which sits on each of the floor levels above the toilet accommodation, but on every facade, around every 3 meters, there's an opening window. So should this building become ultimately cellularized in a more institutional fit out, then each of those cells, individual cells, can still get access to air. Now, of course, we are in a position here. Toby picked up on the sort of Clean Air Act for Bristol, all those are the ambitions for that. We're in a sort of fairly decent position here, moving the building away from the more busy streets onto the side streets. In terms of air quality and acoustics, we have more of an ability to be able to do this. But nevertheless, we feel as a strategy, it's a kind of opportunity for future-proof the building moving forward. So the building really operates in 2 modes. So there's a sort of this idea about a free running mode, where for 2 seasons of a year, the air temperature is such outside that one can turn the fresh air supply off from high level and just provide fresh air from opening a window. And I think the depth of the floor plan allows us to do that. So for around half of the year, we can turn that energy demand off. Obviously, that has an improvement on our sort of carbon story, and has an improvement for tenants in terms of their running costs as well. When the air temperature outside is too hot or too cool to benefit from the inside comfort, then the windows are shut and the tempered fresh air provided from high level. And on this section, you can see also the idea around cooling by running cold water embedded in the concrete slab. So that's our kind of sort of radiator of coolth on the soffit. So very simple in terms, or at least extracting it from our BIM model makes these things look very simple. Kath knows they're much more complicated in reality, but putting the core, all the sort of core functions and services above the washroom accommodation within the main core. So we're passing air and services shorter distances rather than running them up and down buildings to centralized plant. We felt that was really important, but nevertheless, a very simple layout to allow lots of flexibility for any Cat B. A photo here of a sort of fairly recent photo of the slab going up, and just you can see the detail of this extruded plastic pipework which comes into the slab to run the cooling. So the concrete becomes this sort of idea around doing more with less. So the structures that clearly holding the building up, providing the aesthetic finish for the building, and also providing the coolth in the building as well. And you can see here from a recent shot that the sort of the height of those ceilings and that view looking out back towards through the canopy of the trees out towards Portwall Lane. And then just an end slide of the approach from street level. So we're looking to occupy the lower half floor and that first floor. And for us, just sort of picking up on that point about occupiers, it was very much about learning lessons of being involved with previous buildings, working with Nord to bring that to Bristol, and ultimately for us to sort of enjoy occupying this space. We've always been champions for that ability of encouraging a user's engagement with their building. So rather than this idea about a sealed box, a sort of white space, vanilla space, trying to provide spaces of character, of legibility, and I think through that you can get a sort of engagement from the users into their space. And I think it's about that connection post-pandemic and a sort of reset of attitudes towards environment, carbon story becoming ever important, as we all know. And it's more about that being less of a kind of tick box exercise, as I think historically it was with BREEAM and other sort of awards, if you like. It's now becoming more of a mindset and an approach and an expectation. And I think what we've sort of discovered talking to those on this presentation and out elsewhere in the market is this expectation for tenants to want to come into the space, and very much talking from our own experience here, sort of, and trying to get ourselves back into the office as a place to work. You know, we have to make the offices better than our home work environments. We need to encourage people to come in. We need to provide for flexibility of how people occupy that space. Maybe they use it for part of the day for collaboration and move away to other areas of focused work. So it's about a space being flexible enough to deal with that. And I think it's also as sort of recognizing that importance of employees who, whilst working from home, we've all seen those graphics on the news, and Kath had a very similar thing with her that investigation around the classroom idea about we've seen the graphics of you close a window, dirty particles circulate and infect everyone. You open a window, they start to disseminate. So I think we've got this idea that this reality rather that employees are seeing that, they're understanding that, they're saying to their employers, why should I come back into the office? How is it healthy? What are you doing to help mitigate some of the challenges that our working environments now face? So I think there is this sort of turn towards tenants and employers wanting that ability to open a window. It's a very tangible thing. It's a very real thing to be able to open a window, feel a breeze on your face. It might not change the indoor air temperature, but it changes your perception and mindset around comfort, which I think is really key. So it is about that kind of user engagement with the building, rather than the building taking over and becoming a sealed box. There, of course, is a challenge, I think, as an architect and working with engineers like Kath, we're aware of the challenges around increasing the amount of ventilation rates into spaces, and in doing so, driving your energy costs up, which are working against the whole carbon story and challenge, which is the sort of biggest challenge our industry faces, I feel. And I think there's a balancing of that, which inevitably moves to a kind of de-densification of offices. And I think as an occupier of this building, we'd be looking to come in and occupy it, not at sort of 1 to 5 or 1 to 6, as historically as architects we tend to occupy open plan spaces, but coming in back towards closer to 1 to 8 and a 1 to 10. And of course, changing our working patterns where we might be occupying the space more like 60% rather than 80% expectation, with a more sort of transient nature of people coming in to collaborate and get best use out of that space. So I think as occupiers, as architects and now occupiers of this building gives us the opportunity to really sort of put our money where our mouth is and live and occupy in a space that we've been trying to demonstrate on a lot of sort of previous buildings as being the right direction of travel. And it feels good that we're here today discussing the importance of ventilation post-pandemic. There's been an acceleration of that direction of travel, but I think the workplaces of the future are going to be very, very different, and all for the good. That's it. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you all very much indeed. That was insightful, and hearing it straight from the horse's mouth is great stuff. So I really appreciate your time and effort into that. Let's jump straight into a few questions, and thank you to members of the audience who have been submitting some thoughts into the chat room there. Let's just pick up on that point that Steve was mentioning at the end there on density, and it was a question from Carl, is that are we expecting densities to decrease going forward? And I think as agents, we are guilty of telling people like you, Toby, aren't we, that, oh, it's got to be 1 to 8, otherwise, occupiers aren't interested, they want to cram them in. Clearly, we've been wrong all along, and we're going back the other way. Well, is that something, Toby, you expect to see continuing, or how do you see that playing out?
Well, don't blame yourself. And as someone who used to operate in your world, I remember having long discussions with landlord and developer clients saying, occupiers look at office space as an overall occupational cost per user. So clearly, like leverage, if you bring the densities down, you get more bang for your buck, essentially. And clearly that was driven by corporate decision making and kind of behavior at the time. And it was, I suppose, a way that developers were able to justify increasing capex in your building. So along with having, so if greater density allows you to, let's say, increase your rent, and overall your NOI on the business plan goes up, that will give you more headroom to install improved MEP. My concern with reducing density, well, my concern around this whole thing is that occupiers will say, I only intend to put half as many people in the building, but I want it to perform exactly the same. And of course, I understand that, we understand that, but there will clearly come a point then that will put pressure on rents and yields and the sort of general overall cost of occupying an office, and I think that's something that as a sort of free market will sort of balance out. But I certainly think that what we could see is buildings operating in different modes across a building, and having the ability to have sort of downtime across spaces, so that you have from a cost but also from a carbon perspective, you've got your hard working spaces where people are in high densities like cafes and gyms and reception areas and meeting and breakout areas and collaboration spaces that are, let's say, in use all the time, because that's what people will want workspaces is for going forwards. Whereas that kind of space that is more kind of an on-demand basis, like areas where people sit down at desks and so on, and are less collaborative, that are maybe dare I say it, busier on Tuesdays, Wednesdays and Thursdays, and less busy on Mondays, and obviously very much less busier on weekends. can be dialed back so that you're, you're a bit more sort of cautious on that. But definitely, if the question is, are densities under pressure for the first time in that direction, I think our view is yes, they are. But I don't think that's filtered. It would take a very brave developer, I think, to say, okay, we've listened to the market. We're now going to build something that can only really satisfy 1 to 12 or 1 to 14, because that's a big backward step to where we were 15 or 25 years ago, probably.
Yeah, and I think it's a horrible phrase, isn't it? This flight to quality. We're definitely seeing that as a new trend coming through. Someone's going to come up with a better line than flight for quality. But yeah, I think people still want that same quality of space, if not better quality space. They might take less of it, but they're willing to pay a bit more for it.
Yeah, that's the hope. Yeah, of course. But then, of course, that leaves a big wide open question on, what happens to all the redundant stock that isn't good enough, as Stephen probably highlighted, and Kath knows from, I'm sure, other projects. Existing buildings where there isn't really that open door to sort of reimagine the building, because fundamentally it doesn't have lots of the kind of built, the latent value, to bridge off into a quality building.
I suppose then let's feed on that then back to you, Steve. Do you think we're going to end up with a two-tier market in the commercial world, in that there's the buildings which have the ability or are developed with greater floor to ceiling heights, openable windows, better ventilation, more outdoor space, which actually is not just a token terrace as it used to be back in the day of a couple of meters where you could literally stand there. It's actually working space. Is that going to be up here? And then we're going to have that secondary stock, which is going to struggle, which is going to be very much a second quality or second tier of quality.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Andy. I think it's I think the answer is no. I think there'll be it's about a character, space, and flexibility in the market. And I think it's the real challenge for us here is, how do we achieve these ventilation rates and improvements, working against potentially the sort of carbon journey which we're all on. I think the sort of repurposing and reinventing of older stock will become ever more important for us. I think we're sort of going back, and as architects, we sort of cut our teeth on converting old buildings and making them good, modern, sort of delightful places to work. And we learned a lot from that. We've sort of, as an organisation, drifted into having the sort of benefit of being able to design for new buildings. We always say kind of buildings with their own new facades on them. And I think actually we're sort of now seeing a kind of full tilt where we're getting more and more interest in older buildings. And when I say older buildings up to 20 years old, being kind of reinvented for the modern market. And it's picking up on all the points that I think tenants and occupiers are sort of starting to demand. And I noticed there's a sort of comment in the Q&A stream around that says, has it taken a global pandemic to act as a trigger for these concepts? A fantastic question. And I think it probably isn't. It hasn't taken it. It's not a trigger, but it's an acceleration of the direction of travel that I think we're in. I'm sure Toby has had sort of similar experiences with sort of tenants wanting outdoor amenity, wanting access to air and volume. Some buildings naturally give that, others don't. I think we just, as designers and those who deliver these projects, need to work smarter and think sort of more cleverly about how we achieve that. But it's a fantastic challenge. I think we need challenges like this to get the best out of us and out of our buildings. So
can I just chip into that, which is that insofar as we've started to look at buildings now when we assess projects, particularly existing buildings where you're having to sort of reimagine it on a volumetric basis. So we obviously all talk lots about square feet and square meters, and I think Cass encouraged us to do this in the past as well, which is, look at its adaptability for the future. And one of the sort of numerical ways of doing that is to do it in sort of meters cubed, because that gives us a more of a feel for the sort of latent value in the asset you're trying to bring up to date. So maybe, and this is a bit far-reaching and moves off from air quality, but maybe maybe that's something we look to in the future, which is looking at valuing through volume.
Okay.
And I was going to add that the whole density piece, you've got to look at it and think about it strategically and how people use a building, and if you can actually, given we're talking about ventilation, move air around to suit where the people are at that time of day. So it all becomes demand control ventilation, and that plays well into the net zero carbon piece as well. It becomes very important. I think you need to be measuring the air quality and providing the air where you need it and not where you don't. And then that means you can make the central plant smaller And you can get more out of an existing building that's got probably lower floor to ceiling heights by doing that. Okay,
great. And thank you, Derek, for all of your comments on the Q&A and the chat, and is telling us that the BCO will be updating the briefing note in due course. So that is good. Just go back then, Kath, to that net zero carbon point, because it clearly is a big point at the moment. And, you know, there is the guidance, as you quite rightly touched on, to say that the ventilation rates will be increasing, but that clearly has an impact on the energy use. Is there a contradiction there going forward?
I think in pandemic mode, possibly, because the guidance is to run systems quite high vent rates. But as I just said, I think you need to look at demand control ventilation and using air quality sensors, and then actually you can overcome that by providing the air where it's needed to give the good quality air to the people when they're in that space. So it's moving it around from the cafe area at lunchtime to back into the workspace during the day. And the other thing that Steve touched on is obviously mixed mode is a huge opportunity for reducing the energy used for ventilation by using natural vent. It's not going to be applicable in all buildings. It'll depend on the air quality outside. It depends on the floor plate. But on some buildings, like Portland Square, it's obviously a no-brainer, and that's great from energy and occupants.
Do you think, Kath, will also be moving more towards, on that same vein, displacement systems then? You see more of those coming through? Maybe it's one for Toby as well to touch on.
Well, displacement vent's an interesting one when you actually look at the viral control, because it's a very good way to get good air quality into the breathing space, but actually conversely, it can trap the virus in a layer, because basically if people are speaking loudly or coughing, because it stratifies, it can actually trap it at people's kind of head level. So it's not necessarily the best solution for a pandemic, but then looking beyond the pandemic, it is a great way to ventilate a space, and it's a low energy option. So it's a difficult one to figure out what's going to happen once we get over this. Hopefully we will.
Yeah, let's hope so. Toby, do you want to come in on that at all, or has Kath answered that one?
Well, I'd just be interested to ask Kath the question. So, Kath, if you weren't driven by what occupiers want, or in some cases think they want, around a ventilation system, is it right that sort of a chill beam solution would be one of your sort of front runners for a low carbon and sort of virus mitigating system, and as an alternative to 4-pipe fan coil, or have I got misremembered this conversation?
Right, so there's two different things which are kind of not, so mixing systems seem to be the best to get rid of the virus. So actually fan coils work quite well, as long as there's adequate fresh air into the space. However, on not thinking about the virus and just thinking about what I think is like the way that we should be heading, which is not necessarily always 4-pipe fan coils, I've done quite a lot of work in Europe, and I like the approach they have, which is a lot more passive. So they look at adaptive thermal comfort, so you're not always trying to hit 24 degrees, and they look at making sure the facade works hard and doesn't bring in the solar gain. And then you can do the things like they're doing in Portland Square with the embedded coils in the facade. And you can look at doing things like displacement vent, but then you get into the density discussion again, because once you ramp up the density, these things tend to fall over.
That adaptive comfort thing's really is sort of really interesting, isn't it? It's that sort of that passive approach is around facades and structure and services working together, as I said earlier. And I think it is interesting. We joked, didn't we, Toby, as we sort of joined this call, that we've all put a shirt on for possibly the first time in months. And I wonder whether the sort of attitude of people coming back to the office as a place to work, and how we might dress and feel comfortable, will sort of ultimately change and sort of make us more relaxed around our working environments. It's become a real leveler. And I think we've all been in meetings on Zoom and Teams where we'd historically been in a meeting room, in a boardroom somewhere with everyone in suits, feeling slightly awkward. And now you're seeing the same people in sort of shirts and in sort of t-shirts. So there's a sort of changing attitude. Again, it's around not ticking that box. It's about a sort of change in mindset, isn't it?
Yeah, and just for everyone's benefit, we were talking about wearing a shirt as an alternative to a t-shirt, not being shirtless on our Zoom calls, in case you're thinking about doing business with AHMM or Canada in the future.
Absolutely.
But I do think you raise an interesting point, you know, sort of tangentially from that, which is, you know, people are willing to, very few people in the UK at least have air conditioning in their homes, and working from home has been no problem. And yet, as soon as people are in an office, you get this massive polarization across even a small floor plate. Someone saying, "Oh, I'm freezing," and someone saying, "Oh, I'm boiling. What are we going to do?" And I think with and that's just a sort of something that you can feel. Whereas I think with air quality, you're obviously you can't feel it necessarily, although I suppose at extremes you probably can. I think we ought to get to the point where you can, with the smart building app technology, you could almost decide to come into the office on a day when the internal air quality is likely to be at its best, or the widest delta to external or your home air quality. Because I think, as Kath's slide showed, you know, indoors in an unventilated space, if you imagine yourself being, I don't know, in your home office at home during the winter when you're unlikely to open the windows, it's a high chance that your internal air quality is vastly worse than what you would find if you came into a high quality office environment. And I think that will start to impact on productivity. And going back to my point at the beginning, which is users demand office space now and not CEOs. The CEO is going to start, obviously it becomes a CEO's problem if productivity declines, the consequence of people, I don't know, having the sick building syndrome thing, but as a consequence of home working.
I agree with that, Toby. I think it's becoming very much more about individual empowerment, and it's, you know, if you can get over that point, then it's on to retention and recruitment of staff as the secondary point. Derek asked a good question here. This is probably one for you, Kath. You know, will a chilled beam let the cooler air fall downwards and drag the virus aerosol downwards too?
Oh, I haven't seen any studies, to be frank, with chilled beams, so I don't know the answer to that, to be honest.
I think from a market perspective, the chilled beam is not popular, be it from across the board, I think, but clearly it does have some benefits.
Why don't occupiers like it, Andy? What's the reason?
I think it's viewed as being inflexible, and I think probably because you go back circa 5 to 10 years, maybe nearer 10 years, there were some pretty awful systems out there with these huge sort of bulkheads which were protruding from the ceiling, and they looked ugly. It was hard to partition against. It just felt a very archaic system, and I think it had bad press.
But it's quite low on carbon consumption, isn't it, Kath? Chill beam, and so maybe it should have a renaissance, because if we have these tall ceiling heights that Stephen's talking about, for example, then your bulkhead's less of an issue, and we're cellularizing much less than we used to. Or at least that's my understanding, and we're using spaces very flexibly, so they're open, and maybe you've got kind of, you know, flexible spaces with demountable partitions that you can move around day to day.
There's chilled ceiling systems you get out in the Netherlands and Belgium, I think, particularly, and they go in nearly every building out there, new build office, and they are obviously very passive, but they're also very flexible, because they're basically just like coils above the ceiling. So you can just move it around to suit your partitioning, because we're looking at a fit out in Belgium with that system just now, and I was quite impressed with it. It's obviously a different aesthetic, but it's probably more flexible than that traditional chilled beam.
Yeah.
Okay. I think Pradam, you asked a question in regard to, were we referring to, or Steve referring to, mixed mode rather than natural ventilation? I think probably subsequently he's answered that one through one portable square as the example there. I'm just conscious of time as well. We are nearly at the end of the hour, which we had allocated. I think most of these points, all of these points from Carl, Pradam, and Derek, I think we have, through discussion or through the actual presentation, have covered. So thank you everyone for your input. I think unless there's anyone has any points to wrap up with, or to finish off with, we can probably wrap this up. Panel, have you got anything you want to add as a footnote?
Thank you very much.
No? Okay, well, look, thank you all, Catherine, Toby, and Steve for that. That was great stuff. Hopefully everyone enjoyed listening to that and found that useful. For future events, please go to the bco.org.uk website. and Matt Heeman, who's chair of the Southwest region, I know was keen to try and get some more actual physical events, and I know that there is one coming up in August for a walking tour around the development sites of Bristol. So keep an eye out for those as they come up. Well, thank you for attending. We'll leave you to go and have your lunch and have a good rest of the Wednesday and rest of the week. And thank you all again. Bye.
Thank you, Andy.
Bye.
Bye.